privileged also to be part of such a distinguished panel. We have a long-standing relationship with the WSCIJ, and we know that it's worked for many years to provide a strong platform for public debate and to develop the quality of investigative journalism in Nigeria. I'm very proud that for a number of years now, the British High Commission in Nigeria has been a partner and a friend of the Centre, and it's a relationship that I hope will continue for many years to come. So, on to freedom of information, and with a very small apology, but a very small one, and at the risk of teaching you to suck eggs, I'll talk a little bit about why freedom of information matters, and then about the UK's experience with FOI, in the hope that that will complement what we've heard already. In a strong and democratic society, it's vitally important that the public is able to access the information it needs to hold government to account. It's a principle that, despite the challenges and the occasional embarrassment it results in, the British government strongly believes in. Information is power, and the government's attitude, or a government's attitude towards sharing it, says much about how it views power itself and the relationship it has with the people that elected it. The key question is whether government views its engagement with the electorate as something that comes round every few years with the ballot box, or that's something that's continuing and continuous, a genuine partnership between government and people, serving the interests of the people it claims to represent, and not its own self-interest. As we've heard, freedom of information exists in many parts of the world. In the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and a number of countries in Africa itself, including, of course, Nigeria. There are sensible exemptions to the release of information, where national security is at stake, where a police investigation might be prejudiced, where a commercial contract might be exposed. But the broad principle must be that where information is held by a public body, it should be available to proper scrutiny. As we all know, there's a great deal of mistrust and scepticism in politics and government. Here in Nigeria, certainly in the UK, and in many other countries around the world. Freedom of information is about allowing people to look inside government, to understand how decisions are made, how much they cost, why mistakes are made, and why politicians and officials conduct themselves as they do. So let's have a brief look at the British experience. We've already heard and seen from the Unilag initial concept presentation that Britain has a long history of secrecy. And we're still revealing some of the secrets of the past, including our colonial history. During my lifetime, that has changed fundamentally. Nonetheless, in legislative terms, the Freedom of Information Act in the UK is a pretty new invention. Passed by the Labour government in 2000, for the first time it created a statutory right for the public to access information held by public bodies and publicly owned companies. Anyone, anywhere in the world, including all of you here, is able to submit a Freedom of Information request. And there are over 100,000 public bodies in the UK to choose from. whether it's a small parish council, the office of the Prime Minister, or august institutions such as the BBC. Any information can be requested, from the serious to the ridiculous. A quick check of requests shown to my organisation, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, shows the range of queries that we receive. At one end of the scale, the UK's policy in Afghanistan, and at the other, the cost of maintaining a stuffed snake in the Foreign Office library. About 120,000 requests are made each year. Most are made by ordinary people requesting information in areas that they are interested in what the government does on their behalf. About a third are made by journalists, and a small number by businesses. The range of requests is impressive and startling. A quick search for FOI for information on the BBC's website brought up page after page after page of results. And the first of these alone included, for example, the contents of the British government's wine cellar, housing benefit cuts in local authorities, prison sentences imposed on women, letters from Prince Charles to government ministers, and expenses claimed by the Speaker of the House of Commons. Most FOI requests simply provide the applicant with the satisfaction that comes from finding the answer to something they were interested in. They don't result in newspaper headlines, and they don't change government. But every so often they can have a profound and lasting effect. Arguably, the most spectacular surrounds British MPs' expenses. And in that context, I was fascinated by Professor JFO's closing comments reflecting on Nigeria's National Assembly. I expect many of you will be familiar with the case in the UK. The whole history could take me hours to go through, and I won't bore you with many of the details. But what began as a simple request for details of MPs' expenses claims ended with resignations, sackings, retirements, and for some, imprisonment. From duck ponds to moats, washing machines to toasters and beyond, the case exposed sharp practice and fraud among some of our parliamentarians, including some very eminent ones, provoking public outrage and deep embarrassment for the government, Parliament, and all political parties. The FOI Act helped expose that scandal, and we still live with the consequences of it. In just the past week, there's been the announcement of a prosecution of another former Member of Parliament on allegations of false accounting and fraud. And there is currently controversy over the future salary increase for MPs that a newly established public body has recommended. As a strong advocate of freedom of information, the British High Commission in Nigeria has worked closely with organisations here to help make your Freedom of Information Act work for Nigerians. Your act is much more recent than ours, and it will take time, as it did in the UK, to bed in. Public officials and politicians here will, over time, need to change their instincts and attitudes from one of secrecy and the protection of information to openness and transparency in the work they do. And just to reassure you, 13 years after the introduction of our Freedom of Information Act, our public bodies can still be obstructive. So we still have a way to go. FOI comes with challenges. For institutions, government departments like mine, it's time-consuming and labour-intensive. When we receive an FOI request, we are expected to drop everything to deal with it as a priority. And I have to say, as a bureaucrat, that can be a pain. But it's a necessary part of democracy, and it's something we do willingly. But former British Prime Minister Tony Blair said that the UK's Freedom of Information Act was one of the worst mistakes he ever made. But in the light of all we know as a result of FOI, I disagree. Respectfully, of course. We applaud Nigeria for passing FOI legislation. But in some ways, actually in many ways, that was the easy bit. The difficult part, the challenging part, is implementation. And not just for politicians and officials. Ordinary Nigerians, civil society groups, academics, journalists, every one of you here today, and everyone with Nigeria's best interests at heart, needs to grab hold of the power FOI gives you and wield it by asking the difficult questions and demanding the answers the FOI Act says that you're entitled to. Freedom of information matters. Citizens have a right to know. However uncomfortable that may be, that's the essence of democracy.